We're on, Chris.
Good day. Welcome, everyone, to the Conflict Consortium's virtual workshop. I'm appropriately wearing currently my Protesting Something shirt because we have need of that. Today we have José Kaire. Am I pronouncing that right? Let's get that right.
Yeah.
Let's get that right.
Yeah, I think so. Kaire.
You think that's right? No. What is it? How do you pronounce your last name?
Kaire.
Kaire.
Pretty close.
You need to get it right. I don't want close. I want exactly. Okay. Compensating Dictators: How International Pressure Can Lead to More Repressive Autocracies. We have Koga. I'm like mispronouncing everybody's name today. Is that Yoon? Is that better? Is that
June?
June? Koga?
Yeah. I actually, because I'm married, I now have my name is Sudduth. But anyway.
Sudduth. See, all these complexities. This is good to know. Nice to formally get that right. We move to you, and then we open up.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. So there are 5 minutes, so I'll focus on 3 main points which I came up with, which I would like to discuss. So the first one is basically the main hypothesis is really about, so there's 3 actors, the leaders and elite, or sorry, the selectorate and international community. And because the international community wants to introduce transparency, but that would hurt the elite or the selectorate. So therefore, the leader basically compensates them with introducing a higher level of repression. So my first question is, if they means here, authoritarian leader, if the leader really care about the international community or reputation to introduce transparency, why do they, let the selectorate to repress the citizens? Because that's obviously caused the international organization or international community to basically this is kind of against the value of democracy, it's against the value of I was wondering why from the starter, if they introduce transparency, that means that they care about the international community, and eventually they let their military to repress people. It's basically kind of cause another international problem. Okay, so that's that. And then second point is, so in order to, so there is the strategic interaction between the leader, autocratic leaders, and the elite, or the, selectorate in this context. And basically the key here is because the selectorate has the threat to oust the dictator via coup, this coup outcome, the leader let the selectorate to have more political control, which is basically about the higher repression. To me, it's a bit kind of it's not really criticizing, but I like to see more discussion about this point, was that this point, so the repression here is really the concept of repression against people who are outside the regime. So it's really about the regime insider or elite vis-a-vis the regime outsider, repression against regime outsider. So in that context, it seems to me that the selectorate and the leader should be on exactly the same side. In this paper, it seems like in order to avoid coup, leader just introduce a higher level of repression so that if there is no coup threat, you mean the leader doesn't need to have a high level of repression. And also in the game theory part on the the page, excuse me. I'm talking about the payoff here. So at the very end, if as a selectorate choose the size of the repression, and then the ruler accept or reject, there is ruler gets the minus, real, and then on the other hand, elite will get plus real. It basically shows that the size of repression is positively affect the selectorate, while it actually negatively affects the leader, autocratic leader. But again, it seems to me that when it comes to repression against regime outsiders, outsiders, including leader and selectorate, should be on the same page. So I mean, on this point, usually, you know, like this type of literature, like Svorik's piece, usually in order to avoid coup, they provide more resources. It's really about the bargaining between leader and the selectorate. It's not really about the threat outside of the regime. Okay, and then finally, quickly, I kind of like to know more about the concept of collective action and how you measure. So it's basically, it's about the elite as the selectorate's capability to coordinate to oust the dictator via coup. So this collective action capability or coordination capability is measured by the power sharing concept made by Svorik. And it basically said that basically the parties or legislature, the higher the party and higher legislature, as the existence of a party or legislature, increase the coordination capability of the selectorate. So therefore, they will, I guess, they have a higher capability to oust the dictator. But it seems to me like these kind of, you know, semi-democratic institutions are typically kind of co-opt the, you know, elite, so that they are typically diminish the probability of a coup occurrence. So I was wondering, like, whether there is better, you know, measure measure concept to measure the capability, coordination capability. Sorry. So that's my 3 main points. I think I wanted to discuss at the beginning. Sorry.
Jose?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Thank you for your comments. These are really excellent comments. And it's good to know, because I thought I had addressed some of these issues, but obviously I need to do a better job at that. So let me just go from the more recent comment to the more let's start with the most recent comment about measuring collective action. I really struggle with this, and it's a tricky thing to measure, right? Because you cannot like observe it in any direct way. So I thought that just inferring it from the institutions would be the best strategy, and I'm open to doing it differently, because like I said, I really went back and forth on this. I like the idea of focusing on this, because on the institutions, I mean, because 2 reasons. I can actually observe those, and the second one is because it's similar to the same calculus that the dictator is making, right, when trying to decipher, okay, so what are the chances that I'm going to actually face opposition? She's likely to take on the cues that these institutions generate. So in regards to these institutions serving to co-opt the regime elites or the selectorate, I think that's possible. I don't know if I would say that they are just co-opting, because it's also empowering them in a way, right? So you get in a position within the state, and therefore maybe the autocrat can more directly influence you, but you also get the power to pursue your own interests, right? And that way can avoid complete cooptation, if that makes sense. So, and then the point about the selectorate on the outsiders. So the way I was thinking about it is, what the selectorate really cares about are guarantees that they are going to be able to maintain control over the political arena, right? So what they want are insurance that if a political challenger that is not currently part of the electorate is rising up and trying to challenge the status quo, then the ruler is willing and able to halt that effort and protect the interests of the electorate. So that's why the outsiders are important, because they are a threat to the electorate, and particularly like political challengers. If that makes sense. If not, just let me know, because I really want to nail this down. And then, yeah, so the part about why the autocrats want to, why repression is a negative cost. Well, it's a cost for the ruler. The reason there is that, like you were saying, I'm thinking in symbolic terms about the cost of empowering a repressive regime, right? So usually the autocrat needs an organization, either the army or someone else, to be able to repress, which carries all sorts of risks for the autocrat, right? Because then you're empowering this new political actor who is going to have demands for policy. They want autonomy from your regime. So you're creating a challenger. So the less repression you can, plus it's just divisive, right? And that's also a very important point. Repression is divisive. So the more you can avoid having to rely on that, the better. So that's why the ruler wants to avoid repression.
Jose, you're winding down or leaving an opening. We're more than willing to fill it. Were you done? We just wanted to give you that chance.
Okay. I'm done.
You're done. June, you didn't actually introduce yourself, just to kind of get who you are before we proceed on. Yes.
Hi. My introduction. Hi, I'm June Koga Studies, and I'm a lecturer at the University of Strathclyde. And my research interest is autocracies and I would say authoritarian accountability to coup d'etat.
Thank you. Joe, you're up. Introduce yourself at the beginning.
And Jen, if you would mute when you're not, that'd be great. You're not talking.
So I'm Joe Wright, Penn State University. I guess I study dictators. This is a really interesting piece. Appreciate the opportunity to have a look at it. I wanted to directly sort of reframe maybe one of the questions that June proposed. And I think one of the struggles that I had reading this paper that she highlighted was that you know, the preferences of the dictator and the leader and the selectorate differ with respect to the level of repression, and this is repression directed at the masses that presumably preserves the regime in power. And it's just hard for the framing of the paper to understand why this would ever be the case. And Jose's answer was, I think, the right one, insofar as you're providing potentially, and here's a think about just a way of interpreting that the row parameter, and making that clear in the language of the paper, is that row is essentially giving some sort of resources that enables that agent to do the repression of society outside, and thinking about the negative. How giving more row hurts the dictator or the leader. There's two ways to think about it. One is that is actually giving up resources, and that, but more importantly, I think, and this is where there's a more direct negative consequence for the dictator, is that whatever the repression or whatever row is that he's giving away to the selectorate actually increases their likelihood that they can succeed in a coup. Right, and this is, if you go to the chapter in Svillick's book on the agency problem that the military has with a dictator, you know, that's the key parameter that is just assumed that there's no risk involved. And I think that's where some real work can be done theoretically, is that when the dictator has to give an agent repressive capacity, whether it is coordination, goods, or resources, the reason the dictator doesn't do that all the time is because that can actually hurt the dictator. And so that to build in that in the model, the loss to the dictator, so that it don't always give repression, you have to parameterize that as negative. And that just seems weird the way that it's discussed right now. So you need to really clarify that aspect of it. And of course, ultimately, I'm not saying you do that in this model, but if you really want to work on this question, is to endogenize rho into the probability of coup success. Right, so the more goods you give to repress the masses increases the probability of coup success, and that endogenizing it is going to, instead of just taking this rho as something I select that which is negative, but doesn't enter into the probability of coup success in terms of the rebellion, or I guess you have it called rebellion here, but June would call it probability coup success into that function. I think that might be one direction to go in this. But that's a key piece that's right now unclear in the model as to why rho is negatively affects utility of the leader.
Jose, you want to respond or we move?
No, I don't really have I will take that into consideration and try to.
Okay, Will.
Yeah, I don't know if others. I just want to make sure. Are there any other two fingers on this one point? Because I have a very half-formed comment suggestion, but it's a mess. So I'm going to hold off and we'll come back to it. All right. So I'm going to go in a different direction then. So, you've got a model for H1, and then H2 just comes out of nowhere, and the argument behind it I think is fine, but it makes the paper odd, right? So one hypothesis is motivated by a formal model, and the other is not, and I think that's gonna raise some questions at it, when you submit it. And so I'm wondering if, and to take it from a less thinking about trying to publish the paper perspective, wouldn't it be reasonable to expect the selectorate to have the information that the leader has about the extent to which the international system is going to hold the leader's feet to the fire? In fact, some of the members of the selectorate are also subject to indictment by the International Criminal Court and other sorts of, right? So they actually share the risk. So, and if that's the case, if they have that knowledge, then wouldn't it potentially give them some bargaining leverage? I mean, I just complicated my story a little bit. Those members of the selectorate who would not be at risk to such prosecution, wouldn't that give them some bargaining leverage? And so that struck me as a way to try to bring that in to, inside the game rather than just leave it outside the game. The alternative approach is to say, okay, you've developed this game, but how much do you really need the game to motivate H1, right? I mean, can you motivate H1 just verbally and then have both hypotheses motivated verbally and be able to move forward? So I'll leave it at that for now.
Respond or move, respond or move. Jose, you don't have to, man. It's your show. Okay. We're here to help you. Whenever you want to speak, you get the floor.
All right. All right. So I thought I had derived the second hypothesis from the model as well, which is the D parameter that is in the utility of the ruler, right? So basically the idea being that I'm trying to find the equation where it actually appears, but it's actually part of the equilibrium, right? So the idea that as the E goes up, the cost of
I apologize. I see it now. Okay.
Okay. I will highlight that better. And but I was also interested in in the idea of the selectorate suffering the cost from the international community, right? What I was thinking originally when I was writing the paper was like, okay, so the selectorate coups and is able to maintain the regime. So the selectorate is still safe, but they are just ousting the autocrat. So in that sense, they are still like protected. Does that make sense?
Never ask an academic if it makes sense, man. We'll always have a response. Okay, so I got my 2, and then we'll move to Lauren. So my 2 is broadly language. I'm just like, okay, so you say rebellion, but I think you mean coup. Don't do that. Because it's like rebellion, I'm thinking masses in the streets, protests. By I think what you're talking about is coup, so then get me there very quickly, and then I'm talking about coup proofing and different stuff. Political control. Don't use that, man. I'm like, what does that mean? I mean, that's like using the word power, which you also use. There's huge volumes on what the word power means. I'm like, don't use that either. And transparency, okay, you lost me with that too. I think you mean compliance. If that's the case, after every of these like huge mega themes, you need to have in brackets, by that I mean this. Because transparency could mean a bunch of things, and compliance is just one of them. One. So that was my 2 on the language one, because rebellion, coup, I'm with Joe. That kind of confused me a bit, and then some of the others. Lauren, and then to Michael. Demute.
Okay, sorry. It took me a second to demute myself. So I guess I have some comments both on the
Lauren, introduction.
Okay, sorry. So hi everyone, my name's Lauren Young. I'm currently a postdoc at CDDRL at Stanford, starting as an assistant professor at UC Davis in the fall. And I work on, I call it the political psychology of violence. And my dissertation work is on understanding how citizens in Zimbabwe make decisions in a repressive environment. So I'm going to kind of keep my comments now to the theory, because most of what we've talked about so far has been on the theory. And I guess I wanted to broadly open it up because I shared some of the concerns that June had about like some of the assumptions that go into the actors and their strategies not being completely in line with how I view the literature, how I kind of view the world. And so I guess one of the, and just to say, I think this is a very nice and parsimonious model. So I'm focusing on the bad things, but there are many nice things about it. But for the, so you really in your theory have 4 actors, right? You have the autocrat, the group of elites that keep him in power or that are aligned with him, the international community, and then citizens. But in the model, only 2 of these actually show up, and you've kind of folded the other actors into the payoffs that you assigned to the elites and to the autocrat. And this is kind of clever, but in some cases you may go too far. So for example, you have the assumption that we've already talked about, that this rho parameter is positive for the autocrat and negative for the elites. And it's, because the autocrat has internalized what the international community actually wants. But I think June pointed out well that, the international community cares about a lot of things, including repression, if their primary goal is democratization. So, just kind of putting that into the autocrat's payoff seemed a little bit too shorthanded for a paper that's really focused on bringing out the role of the international community in this kind of inter-elite bargaining. So I guess my primary suggestion would be, if you're willing to open up the model again, to think about including the international community as an actor, and, then continuing to kind of leave out citizens. I think that would be like a secondary goal. But leaving out the international community when the focus of the paper is really on them and on their role in this bargaining seemed too much of a kind of shorthand. The other thing I wanted to kind of push back on a little bit is the assumption that transparency is really something that hurts the other elites, but like doesn't fundamentally change the balance of power between citizens and the autocrat. like most of the work that's been done on transparency, including the Hollier stuff and work by people like Scott Tyson, has looked at how transparency influences the balance of power between citizens and the autocrats. And that's kind of just taken out of your model, which I think basically assumes that it doesn't affect that in a way that's important to include. So I think, in positioning this in the literature, talking more about that and justifying that choice to, assume that transparency has no effect on how citizens interact with both of these groups is important. I think I'll actually stop at those 2 points. So yeah, why is the international community not involved? And then second, why this strong assumption that transparency doesn't affect relations between citizens and elites in the autocrat?
Jose, then Michael.
Okay, so I was just thinking about this just this morning. Why the international community seeing repression just kind of says, oh, okay. And what I was thinking is that I'm not really arguing that the international community doesn't notice these patterns of increased repression. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. What I think is that regardless of that, the autocrat has to ensure the selector in some way, because if he wants to stay in power, he needs to keep their support. So even if the international community is noticing an uptick in repression, the autocrat is forced to do that because otherwise he's going to be facing a coup. So that was like the preliminary answer that I had to that. I would be really interested if you find that convincing or not.
Well, I guess my response to that is that what I believe about the world to be true is that the international community does care more about violence, which is, it makes the news, it's very hard to ignore, than they do about something like, reporting economic data to the World Bank. If this is really about democratization, I could imagine, so the assumption that the international community primarily cares about democratization is another thing that I found a little bit unrealistic. So maybe this is a story about, the international community prioritizing something that makes it easier for their companies to work there or for investors, more of a like economic promotion type story. And so they're willing to get the economic data that they need in order to make those deals at the cost of this increased repression. But that's a very different set of assumptions.
Right. Yeah. And as a Mexican citizen, I had that opinion. This is mostly about economic liberalization, first and foremost. So I should justify that assumption.
Yeah, I just want to draw attention to your the empirical domain, 1976 to 2014. I was in 8th grade in 1976, so I'm not that old. But the World Bank and IMF did not care a whit in terms of its policy about conflict and violence. In fact, that's what what the World Bank's violent, civil war project was all about, was trying to get these international institutions to pay some attention. And that started somewhere around, 2000. So by the time it actually has uptake, 2005 is the earliest year you could claim that they started paying attention to, eventually they would bring the Signorelli and Richards database into their decision making, and that would roll into millennial goals and blah, blah, blah. But, for the majority, all but maybe the last 10 years of your sample, that's a very defensible claim that was considered separate. It was just a totally distinct world. And remember, in 1976, there's a Cold War. There's tons of reasons to anticipate that. So I think that the issue on democratization and that assumption, challenging that assumption, I buy on that. But I don't think you actually want to change anything in terms of your expectations of international financial institutions and the extent to which they care about violence. Because for the vast majority of your sample, that was just not, it wasn't part of their world.
My two, sorry, Michael. My two was Abu Harb and Singanelli. I can't believe you don't cite it, because their piece is about the IMF and IMF conditionality and its horrible effects on state repression, because they don't want labor unions, they want poor wages, and they don't want behavioral challenges. So exactly what you suggest that the international community would want, the IMF wants exactly the opposite, and that's surprisingly or not surprisingly, why repression is ramped up when the IMF gets involved. So you need to take them on because you're taking them on. Michael, sorry.
Okay. I'm Michael Coppedge. I'm in political science at Notre Dame and at the Kellogg Institute, and one of the PIs for Varieties of Democracy. I have a whole lot of comments on this. Kind of the overall theme is that I don't really understand it. And I'm sure there's a pristine, cogent, coherent argument and empirics there, but in your mind, but what's written on the page, I got kind of lost here and there for several reasons. And I could divide, I will divide my comments between the model or the theory and the empirics. So that I don't go on too long in my first intervention, I'm just going to talk about the model first, and then we can talk about empirics later. I agree with everything that's been said about challenging the idea of democracy promotion being the overarching goal of most international efforts. I won't on that. I also am not sure about the transparency emphasis. You know, I think it's true that the IMF and the World Bank these days want transparency, a certain kind of transparency. And I actually do like the measure as a measure of a certain kind of transparency about reporting policies and policy compliance. But I don't think that transparency is really what domestic actors, at least I don't think that kind of transparency is what domestic actors, whether they're in selected or not, really care about. They care about inflation and employment and subsidies and public service provisions and infrastructure and freedom too, I think. But that those things may or may not be connected with transparency per se. And I think that there may be some empirical connection between transparency and repression, but I just don't believe that it's the mechanism, it's the reason for any connection between those two things. So instead of focusing on as the concept, this distant proxy for what you're interested in, why not use some more relevant or proximate indicators of prioritizing international demands over domestic demands, things like debt service and restraining the growth of the money supply and unification of exchange rates and subsidy cuts and things like that. I think those would be more direct measures of the kind of prioritizing of international concerns that you seem to be interested in. The second comment is that, you know, I could be wrong about this, but I think that the theoretical discussion or the discussion of the theory doesn't call enough attention to the strategic elements of the model. It kind of reads like each actor merely reacts to what the other actor just did, rather than anticipating how the other actor will respond to its choices and making choices accordingly. I think the predictions of the model are based on that kind of reasoning, strategic reasoning, but I think it's underdeveloped, and there should be more discussion of information that each actor has and how much uncertainty they have about what other people are going to do and what the consequences of their actions are going to be. And let's see, another reason that I feel like I don't completely understand the theory is that in writing the equations, the paper never defines what B sub S is or what P and Q are. They're just variables that show up in the equations. As far as I could tell, they're not anywhere defined. And also, at least in my copy of the paper, the equations on page 9 Some of the terms in those equations apparently didn't make it into the PDF when it was converted, so I couldn't really follow the equations. Or maybe I'm misreading it. A final comment about the model. This kind of goes back to what some other people have said, that about the selectorate. I think that the idea of the selectorate introduces some circular reasoning into the theory. And I'll blame Bueno de Mesquita and Svolik for that more than, I think that if it were objectively clear who is in the selectorate or not, ex ante, and if no one could move into the selectorate or out of the selectorate during the time period that's being studied, it would be fine. But there are situations that you're dealing with in which some actors can be relevant unexpectedly. Protesters who were previously quiescent, or institutions that rarely get involved, but do get involved in extraordinary crises, and so on. And if those actors start to matter despite not having been in the selectorate at the start of the period, then the idea of the selectorate is not really doing explanatory work about what happens. And redefining them as members of the selectorate when they suddenly become relevant is just modifying the theory to fit the facts post hoc. And I don't think it becomes a useful explanation. I don't think that always happens, but it does happen some of the time, and it makes me wonder how useful that.
Jose?
Yeah, that's a really good point that I haven't thought about. Like, how do actors in the selectorate change, especially as these political and economic changes are happening. Maybe I should just drop the concept, because especially I'm not thinking of the selectorate in the same way that Bueno de Mesquita is. I'm more thinking about them in terms of okay, powerful members of the party or people in the legislature and stuff like that. So maybe I can just be more explicit about that. And yeah, I will try to clarify my definitions of the variable. That's a very important point.
So I'll segue to my one with the two, which was I think part of the kind of recurring discussion of the selectorate. So the selectorate I normally associate as kind of like the composition of the group of individuals that are required to keep the leader in power. But you seem to kind of zero in on the security force apparatus, which could be part of the selectorate, but is that kind of what Bueno de Mesquita and all referred to as a selectorate? So I kind of got confused with it, especially when you were talking about rebellion, and then it seemed to be about coups. So I think being clear with that. My one was really, so my first tag on you, the first thing I was unhappy about was the ignoring Abuhag and Sanguinelli. I'm just like, yo, come on, man, they're right on your point. IMF leads to repression. My second tag with you was also historical in nature, which was, how could you ignore the literature on dependency, world systems theory, and all these criticisms of neoliberalism? Your argument is just like, the world seems like a nice place and they want democracy, and how can these things happen? What about the grand conspiracy to get profit? And in line with that, no one gives a damn about anybody's rights. It was all set up to basically extract resources, extract profit, which is going to mean bad things for the people and the citizenry. And so from that perspective, and even the resource curse stuff, right? So if you know you're more beholden to selling oil someplace else, then you care less about your citizenry, right? Along with like Bates's argument. So there's a lot of arguments that suggest that the international community is completely antithetical to interests in human rights. So that will move in a different direction. But the reason why I want you to do that, or the reason why I think you need to focus on those literatures, is they juxtapose this external versus domestic issue pretty well. It's like, are the people in a particular territory beholden to a domestic audience or an external one? And what are the perils of that particular balance? So I think you can kind of revisit that in a way that's really important. But at the same time, you're really taking this territorial integrity thing to be like really serious, right? And I'm just like, okay, I live in this country, so I can't have interests elsewhere in other countries. I'm like, who's saying that? In the sense that you have international and domestic interests. But what if a member of this electorate owns profit or owns part of the ownership of a company that's in another country? So then their interests, are those international interests or domestic interests? So I kind of lost that. And this is like the relative autonomy of states debate, right? There's so many discussions about how porous states are in many respects. And so I kind of wanted you to pay attention to that. The other one was, and maybe I've watched the, who's the guy that made JFK? Michael, you were muted.
Oliver Stone.
Oliver Stone. Maybe I watched the Oliver Stone documentary too many times about U.S. history, but the U.S. history that's depicted there, and the one that I remember from Central Latin America, is about arms, training, coups sponsored by the U.S., putting in dictators, invasion, targeted assassination, and I'm just kind of going, you describe the international community and the U.S. and the West as being like reasonable with regards to human rights, but I'm like, these people are the purveyors of some of the worst human rights indirectly by setting up these dictators in the first place. So I'm trying to figure out what dynamics you're talking about, because sometimes it seems like U.S. interests are international interests. Sometimes it seems like the UN is in line with what the U.S. is talking about, and like you're missing these tensions that exist between, you might say you're for democratization, but you're still going to shoot Lumumba in the back of the head, right? So I'm like, those contradictions that have huge implications, I think, need to get more consistently acknowledged in your argument. Do you have any response before we move?
Well, this useful for helping me think about it, but I need more time to think about these things.
Fair enough. Joe.
Yeah. Let me just try to maybe push you to reinterpret the transparency. I mean, following on the comments that people have made, I don't think this is a problem with the model. I think it's a problem with how you interpret that parameter. Right. These people are, they're seeking economic liberalization and profits for IFIs, for international investors. And it goes back to your example from Mexico. I mean, when you start with an anecdote like that, I was thinking, oh, this is because rich world investors want to act, basically they're running out of profits in the rich world. They want to seek profits in the developing world. So I think that that's going to have big implications for your empirics once you start to reframe that, reinterpret that parameter, if you want to keep this model as being one about seeking economic liberalization, or whatever that means, for not really liberalization, but something that's good for rich world investors. Okay, so that's just one way. It's really pushing you to reinterpret that. Second is before I move to the empirics, is that you make a throwaway comment with, I think, which may have implications for how you do this empirically, but you basically state at one point that, and I'm quoting directly, rulers that do not expect rebellion from their selectorate will care less about the dangers of losing office. And I actually think that's incorrect, because the model already builds into the dictator's utility the expectation or the likelihood of losing office. And so the D parameter doesn't incorporate that, just incorporates whatever those are, whatever the losses are associated with losing office. It's not as if people who are more likely to lose office get worse punishments. Maybe that's the case, but that's pretty, I guess I don't see how that there's anything in the model that suggests that to be the case. So I would not actually I don't think you need to worry about that. But you do need to, as people have pointed out, specify why the leader gets the international punishment, but the selectorate does not. And your response is that the selectorate stays in power, which is fine. However, empirically, the worst punishments that happen by domestic actors, right? You're most likely to be punished if you use the Archigo data and all this kind of stuff. The bad stuff that happens to dictators after they lose power is happening when their regime loses power. and not necessarily when they as individuals lose power, but the regime stays in power. That is, when the selectorate stays in power, the likelihood of really bad outcomes and really bad punishment for the dictator is actually relatively low. That is, you cite the Escriba piece, which shows that personalist dictatorships get bad outcomes, but those are exactly the ones where the leader falls, the regime falls with it. And so it's not consistent with, at least that empirical implication is not consistent with the assumption in the model that that the selectorate survives, but the dictator gets punished. I've got a whole host of empirical comments, but a lot of that depends upon if you really want to go with the transparency as your main measure, because that is that's measuring whether or not you report data, yet there's massive amounts of missing data in the sample that you're using on some of the covariates. So if my rough calculation, so you have to just be careful with how that transparency gets measured, since it's actually a measure of how much missing data there is, and yet there's missing data in the right. So the group of countries that are not in your sample, unless you do multiple imputation of the missing data, are going to be the ones that have the least reporting. Right. So when I just download the transparency index, it's giving me something for everybody, right? But the ones that are not in your estimating sample are the ones that have the least transparency. So on that key variable of interest, I'd be less concerned if it's control variable, but on the key variable of interest, if you're basically excluding all the countries that have low transparency because they don't have aid data reported, or they don't have their growth data reported, or what, they don't have their Amnesty International, that's a good one, right? Right, there's a ton of missing data on that variable alone. And the countries that are missing it are precisely the ones that have the lowest transparency. So you have to be very, very careful when you go to your estimating sample, when using particularly when you want to make a case using the Hollier-Rosendorf-Vreeland index, because that's actually a measure of missingness in and of itself. But I've got more which I'll send you, but that's sort of the big one, big caution when you use that as a to say something theoretically about transparency when dealing with the data that we have.
Yeah, those are excellent points. If I may, I just wanted to talk a little bit about why I chose transparency, and because this kind of keeps popping up. What I was thinking originally was, okay, so I was interested in what happens when the ruler prioritizes the interests of the international community and does so in a way that the selectorate perceives as harmful. And transparency seemed like that be it, right? Because transparency exposes the predatory practices of the selectorate because it incentivizes political challengers. So in a sense, transparency, what was also good, go ahead.
I think this disjunction you're getting here with some of the people who may be that the trade-off is the guy who owns a state-owned enterprise, right? The international investors want a piece of that, and whoever's got that now wants to give it up. I mean, that's your Mexican example, right? So it's not transparency, it's access to investing in those state-owned enterprises, which are just gimmies for the selectorate. Like, they're just cash cows for the selectorate that they're running inefficiently, and the IFIs at the behest of the international investors want a piece of that.
Right.
My two related to Joe's two is on the meaning of the transparency, right? It's like the transparency measure that you're capturing, they're not giving up state secrets or not giving up state secrets. The information that they're giving up it's not that sensitive, right? So I'm just like, transparency for me is like, okay, this is the inner workings of how something functions at every step, and we have all that information all the way up. Transparency would mean you have access to all that information, not the aggregated stuff, but you have access to all aspects of that particular data collection process. Well, you're not talking about that. And actually, you're kind of conflating whether or not you have the capacity to collect this information and you're not giving it up, which is kind of theoretically where you are, or you don't have the capacity to collect it and thus you don't, which is not the same thing. And so what you're calling transparency captures both processes simultaneously in a somewhat different way. But I'm like, if you get me if the information that was contained was actually very sensitive to the state. Like if you were giving up some information that could be used in a particular way, and you could see someone not wanting to do that. But why would the selectorate, I mean, similar to Joe's comment, why would the selectorate care about the information that is given up in the data collection effort that you're identifying presently? And from that perspective, I don't know that you're getting at transparency. I'm not sure if you're just getting at missing this because there might be something else going on there. I'm not quite sure, actually. And I think the alternative explanations for what your measure means might be part of the thing that is kind of confusing me. But Lauren.
Okay, thanks. So I guess I wanted to talk about the operationalizations of some of the variables. And I have some other comments, but I guess I'll just stick to those. So the kind of core parameters that you're testing here are collective action capacity of the selectorate and then the cost of leaving office. And I guess my primary concern is that the measure that you're using for collective action capacity of the selectorate also affects the costs of leaving office. So I think Joe mentioned this Escriba Folks work, which shows that the outcomes for dictators that are ousted differs dramatically depending on the type of regime that they're in, whether it's personalist or whether it's more institutionalized. And so you don't know that you're really getting like separation. You have this kind of composite measure of how institutionalized the selectorate is, but that also affects the cost of leaving office. And then I guess, yeah, the other concern or question that I had was around the use of these Amnesty International reports as a measure of the cost or a proxy for the cost. I mean, you recognize in the paper that there is, the potential for endogeneity, where those, the existence of Amnesty International reports are correlated with repression because they try to cover repressive states, and you do lag this in the later model. So I guess it's a very basic question, like if the lagged version of this is the less endogenous, why not use that from the beginning? But then the more kind of like serious question is, my opinion, this variable is kind of picking up so many things that it's really hard to use this as the key measure of one of your key parameters in the model. So I would push you to think about other things that might pick up the cost of leaving office. As I mentioned, the kind of type of regime is one. I also was thinking that the Archigo data might be something you could look at to code, what happened to past leaders who had been ousted in that kind of state. Were they killed? Did they end up in exile somewhere really nice? And I didn't see it cited, but another paper that you might look at to get ideas is the Escriba Folks and I have no idea how to say this name, but Kramaric. I can send you the link, but they have this paper on where dictators go when they go into exile. And one of their kind of takeaways is that if you're in a democratic neighborhood, for example, or like a neighborhood where lots of countries are part of the ICC, or if you're leaving power after the ICC has been created, this might raise the costs of leaving office and cause dictators to maintain power longer. So I thought, one way you could go, if you don't want to look at the Archigo data and look historically, would be to look at some of those variables and try to come up with a something a little bit more sophisticated that gets at the cost of leaving office for that variable.
Concatenation of twos, starting with myself, then Will, then Joe, and then to Michael. My quick intervention was the cost of stepping down stuff I always thought was kind of intriguing, but why don't we ever link it back to like income or land inequality, presuming that the people that have the concentration of the land are the ones that have a strong attachment to it, and if they lose power, then they're losing a great deal. I mean, ideally, we'd have like bank account or something like that, right? So try to figure out what's your actual cost, right? But that would be something like that. Will.
Yeah, Jose, I want to go back to your sample here and the fact that the extent to which leaders end up under what I like to think of as house arrest, because we've actually got several United States leaders that are now unwilling to leave unwilling to leave the country from the Bush administration, right? And Henry Kissinger also hasn't traveled widely, but that's new, right? So in 1976, that wasn't true. So there's just a temporal domain. You know, you can look at the Justice Cascade work of Sickink or whatever, and you can model that, right? You can model that with a couple of, you know, some dummy variables. One was the ICC form, and others. The exposure of everyone in the sample changes over time, and in ways that, I mean, you know, those are very rough proxies, but the, you know, even if you just had two, right, from ICC exists or not, and then also look at her work, because she's also looking at domestic prosecutions as well, and you can get a rough idea of, like, when am I going to argue this regime is starting to kick in? And since you go through 2014, you know, you're going to have, I think, the opportunity to put that in, but I would want to put that in just cross-sectionally, right? You know, and see if that gives you some purchase.
Joe, quick.
The on measurement here, yeah. So I agree that maybe one direction to go is to incorporate a bunch of that information on the international stuff. You know, Abel's paper that he and I did together, we was regional prosecutions of other dictators in the region. Again, that's picking up the international stuff. I think you want to be careful, and this is a sort of follow up on Lauren's point, that actually the domestic costs or the sources of this domestic sources of punishment are actually, you want to net those out in your equations. And so having the regime type in there is good from that sense, because you're accounting for the domestic sources and therefore isolating the international sources of punishment. Does that make sense? Because that's where your argument comes from, is not the domestic sources. And that's really the key here to addressing one of the arguments that I and others have made, is that you know, the selectorate is if they're staying in power, they're actually the source of the domestic punishment after you lose office. If they don't remain in power, it's a new regime. But you want to net all those out and just focus on the international sources of potential punishment. Okay, and so aggregating that stuff and being very of the international sources, whether it's media reports, actual prosecutions in the region, which is what we use, you know, the advent of the ICC, all that kind of stuff. Aggregating a lot of that information and then accounting for that strong time trend is actually probably where you want to go with it. Second measurement, that's sort of summing up what other people said and giving you an action point. The second point on measurement is, and this gets back to Jun's very first point, is I think one piece you may want to look at is the Gelbach and Kiefer piece in the JLP from a couple of years ago. And they make this argument that parties are the key to allowing elite collective action against the leader. And that's a way that they can actually enforce the bargain with the leader, right? And they have a model that they you have, and then the JLP paper is their empirical paper. But the idea is that the party enables collective action of the selectorate or the elites to punish the leader if the leader reneges on the agreement that they've reached, and that's what helps enforce bargaining. And they have a way of doing that. But the key concept I would focus on there is basically that we're working on in a book right now, but that draws on one of their measures as well, which is does the leader select his party, or does the party select the leader? And when the party selects a leader, the party is much more likely to have the capacity to party elites are much more likely to have the capacity to organize against the leader. When the leader himself has created the party, then you're much less likely to be in that case. And so a lot of new dictators recently either create their own party once they're in power, or more likely recently is they basically created the party in an effort to run in a democratic election, and then they basically authoritarianizing their stuff. Got it.
Michael.
Okay. So here are my empirical comments. First, on the dependent variables, I think conceptually the political terror scale and the press restrictions variables are conceptually fine. I'm not as convinced about the legislative majority margin variable as a measure of repression, because it seems like this is kind of neither here nor there. It's kind of a really downstream outcome of certain kind of repression of political parties and manipulation of elections. But it could just as well be a measure of the institutions that make collective action possible. And so instead, and this is probably very predictable when I was invited, I would urge you to take a look at some varieties of democracy variables. You know, we have hundreds to choose from, including a whole bunch of variables that look at various kinds of repression. So you could look at it in a more nuanced way. You have variables that measure repression of parties, repression of the media, repression of civil society organizations, repression of women's groups, repression of religious organizations. You know, you could break it down in a whole bunch of different ways. And I'm sure it covers all the cases and years that you're interested in. So just put in a plug for that. The model has regime dummies for different types of non-democratic regimes. And I think that's fine if you really do believe that there's a net bonus or penalty that countries pay for having a particular kind of regime. That's not the only possibility. It's also possible that that there's an interaction going on. That is, the effect of some of your other independent variables is a function of what kind of regime it's taking place in. That maybe collective action makes more of a difference, or transparency makes more of a difference in a personalist regime than in a military regime, etc. If that's the case, then you would need interactions. Here's my most important suggestion, very constructive suggestion, I hope, on the empirics, which is, in this paper, it's really important to have a table of summary values for all of your indicators, because I could just not figure out how to interpret these coefficients to know whether low values mean more repression or less repression. About a couple of pages after the table of results, you start explaining that for a couple of the variables, but not for all of them. And it was really hard to figure out, especially when it gets into interpreting the interactions. And I guess I'm not completely clear on what is in those coefficient plots. I assume that it's probably -0.1 times transparency plus 0.06 of transparency times C, but it's not explicitly stated. I think some clarification would be helpful there. Another thing is, in your text, you say that all of your models, well, your model has a lag-dependent variable, but I don't see that in the table of estimates. I mean, did you really control for lag-dependent variable and just not report it, or is it different from what's in the text?
I did.
On figure, go ahead.
I did, and then I took it out. So that was, yeah, that shouldn't be there.
Well, that would be important to clarify. On figure 3, I found figure 3 confusing because you have these 3 subgraphs, and at the bottom of each subgraph, just below the x-axis, is the name of the dependent variable that you're trying to explain. But because they're below the x-axis, it looks like they're labeling the x-axis. So that looks like those values are values of political terror scale, values of press restrictions, etc., but they're not. So I would recommend putting those titles at the top of each of the subgraphs instead of at the bottom, where they wouldn't be so confusing. And finally, the second to the last sentence in the paper says, pushing for transparency seems to be an effective strategy to make autocracies less oppressive and more inclusive of political challengers, which sounds like exactly the opposite of what you've been arguing throughout the paper. Even though the next sentence fragment after that qualifies it, it really seems to undermine what you're arguing here, unless you kind of changed your mind at the end about what the point of the paper is. So it ended up confusing me even more at the end.
Jose?
Yeah, I just wanted to end up on a positive note, right? Because transparency does have a positive effect when there's no collective action. But so I wanted to highlight that. But yeah, that's not the main point of the paper.
Get your story straight.
Yeah.
June.
Right. So yeah, I just a bit different point of view. So about the relationship between the what do you say, coup making, coup threat, and the repression. So your argument is really about coup. The leader will allow them to repress. So the repression is the different variable. But I think it is already, Joe might have said that like 20 minutes ago, but I think you should really think carefully about the opposite direction, like repression to coup. So if the threat from the opposition group is high, obviously the regime needs to empower the military or I guess elite to protect the regime from the opposition group. Empowered military or elite would have a higher capability of making a coup. So therefore, basically the high coup threat coexist. Reason you mentioned, but it's really about it's starting from the size of the opposition group's threat. So maybe if you open up the economy, the challenger getting more, empowered, so the threat of the opposition group increase. Therefore, the leader want to empower the military. Therefore, the military has higher capability of ousting the leader via coup. So the coup is high. They will obviously repress people. So, I think this is Acemoglu, Robinson, and Svorik JCR papers type of thing. I think you don't have to incorporate everything, but I think you have to kind of think the possibility of this direction might be. And then in addition to that, I just want a very small, not really important question, but like empirical, in the empirics, I'm just wondering the repression variable. It's more like a question to maybe Will or Christian, but is this this political terror scale? Is there a possibility that this repression might include the repression against the regime insiders or like elite? Is there like a completely, because when I reviewed this type of paper, it seems like they don't really differentiate the government violence against citizens vis-a-vis, and basically violence vis-a-vis anybody. So if repression variable includes the violence against some of the elite, it doesn't make so much sense in this context.
Yeah, I don't think there's not like a purge component. Well, first, they're not very clear on who the perpetrator and who the victim is, but generally as a kind of categorization, I think that they would suggest that it's individuals that are outside of the leadership, right? So it could be anybody from the citizenry that I think could be or could not necessarily be affiliated with the political authority and power. I think that's the designation that would be most aptly kind of like employed. Will, do you think that's right?
Yeah, I mean, you have to understand that, data sets like Syrian political terror scale are interested in violations of international law. And in those circumstances, it doesn't matter who the victim is, right? The perpetrator is the state. Who the victim is irrelevant. And so they're not going to make those sorts of differences. But that comment reminds me a little bit of what Michael was saying in that, who's in or out of the selectorate can change over time. And I think, once the state is using its repressive forces against you, you're no longer part of the ruling coalition, would be how I would try to respond to that. But of course, the point being that it's not constant over time.
Related, and then going to Joe, if someone were interested in that, I will promote myself on this one. I have a dyadic or diorep database, which is perpetrated by Dyad from 76 to 2012, which does identify who the target is, and I do differentiate a little bit more detailed than the categories that Michael gave, although that's serving as a nice point of kind of comparison, because we get the proper names of who the target is and who the perpetrator is, but it's generally consistent. Joe, you had it too?
real quick on the PTS measure, that stuff is source text to, what is it, either State Department reports or Amnesty International reports or something like that, human rights reports. And Wright, Chris Ferris's work shows that there's actually, unless you account for the time trend in that, that's going to time trend downwards in the wrong, reflecting a better reporting standards rather than a decrease in repression. So anyway, there's a strong time trend in that data. There's also a strong time trend, which I think is real, in the increasing likelihood of being punished internationally. What's hard for us to distinguish is the prospects of being punished, which I guess you're operationalizing by the Amnesty International or the AI reports, or maybe it was the Economist reports, the media reports, something like that, yeah. Right? Those are actually measuring real levels of they're picking up repression, right? So our measures of repression or measures of likelihood of punishment are basically being sourced from the same texts. That's a huge problem no one's solved yet, but there it is.
So, Jose, we generally kind of like reserve the last remaining part of the period for the author to kind of like on the spot take it all in and reflect about how this panel could actually assist you with kind of moving the paper forward. So what are the 2 or 3 things that you're kind of like, okay, so should I do this or that? Or what do you think about that? But kind of like use us in that manner. We've now read the piece, we've now made some comments, we've now heard some of your response to it to get an idea of kind of where you're going. But hit us back now with where do you kind of, what's your pivot point? How can we provide assistance?
Okay, that's great. So I made a bunch of notes, but before that, I had like I said at the beginning, I was very unsure about a few things. First is the way to measure collective action and by the electorate, and the other one was, and this seems to be a big one, the measure of transparency, right? Because what I really care about is just a proxy for compliance to the international community. And as Joe was saying, the current measure of transparency may pose a lot of problems because of missingness and also like conceptually. So if you have any pointers of how I could capture compliance to the international community in another way, that'd be great.
So
if I can I jump in there?
Hey, I wanted to jump in.
Oh, all right, I'm next.
All right. Then jump. So my thing was, so the way you just phrased it, right? That doesn't sound like transparency. It sounds like bending to the will of the international community. Now, if that's what you want to measure, then I'm like, okay, cool. But why wouldn't you then? I mean, think about this, right? It's like, then why not create some latent variable model, which is compliance across the board, right? So you're just like, okay, people have signed this, people have signed this, people have signed this. Are you complying generally? Are you a complier? I mean, like, basically, it's a way of trying to come up with a general measure of bending to the will. But this is kind of like where things get complex, right? So in the Abahab Singuernelli piece, they're just like, well, you're bending to the will of the International Monetary Fund, and those interests happen to align with some domestic elite who want to make as much money as possible. So then it has this joining of interests. So yeah, they're bending to the will of the IMF, but it's exactly where part of your selectorate want to go that results in repressive behavior. So it's the kind of bending in the will to what that I think is the thing that you need to try to figure out. Bending to the will of kind of like nice human rights organizations. I don't view the IMF and the World Bank as nice institutions, right? So it's like, it could be, so that needs to kind of get figured out. But Will, and then Joe.
Yeah, Jose, I want to build off of something Michael said earlier. As I think to the extent that you're interested in compliance, it gives you a real opportunity to strengthen conceptualization and the theoretical tie. Because, your story, which, by the way, I think has a lot of great, I think has considerable face validity. We've picked pretty well at the details and specifics of it, but the basic idea that that an autocratic leader may have different incentives vis-a-vis the international system, and therefore will to gain that will be willing to offer greater protection in the form of repression is intriguing and interesting, and you've got some results to suggest that that's happening. So, what I would encourage you to think about is where, what kinds of measures of compliance would be in the executive's interest and the IFIs or whoever is asking for the compliance, but opposed to many portions, like a large portion of the leader's elite base, right? So, Michael had a variety of suggestions in terms of, for instance, one thing we know that, getting rid of staple crop subsidies is bred riots, right? That's a big risk in terms of the general population. I'm not sure that's a selectorate risk so much, but that's up for you to decide. Right? But what sorts of things, any rupture of the status quo is going to gore certain interests ox. And so thinking about the sorts of things that these institutions demand, if it's transparency and better record keeping, then that's the immediate story comes to my mind is, well, that's a story about making it harder to engage in corruption, right? Whatever, better books make it harder to move money around in ways that are convenient when there are poor books. Is that enough of a story? I don't know. But if you think about it, you can, and if you go the measurement model route, I'm a fan of that. But whether you go direct or measurement model, the more important thing to me is to have a nicer tie to show us that those interests are at loggerheads. It doesn't have to be the whole selectorate, right? And it has to be, or whatever you want to call that winning coalition, that supporters. But it needs to be enough of them that it would be more compelling than people are currently finding it.
Before going to Joe, I think I'd be more comfortable if you said effort at attempted political control than political control, given that repression has a variety of different effects on a population. By offering up repression, it doesn't mean that you're going to get political control. It means that you're offering up the attempt to try to get you there. So it's a small qualification, but it's like that's accepting this very after effect of repression stuff that we know exists, but you made it seem like it's like, you give me this deal and I'll give you some order. And I'm like, you're going to try. That's all you're going to do. Joe.
Yeah, so I was thinking when I was reading through the paper that the dependent variable or that the transparency measure should actually be economic liberalization index. This is what international investors want. Well, call it liberalization because that's what other people call. But that's what international investors want, right? And so there's the domestic cost of that. And what the twist of your argument would be making is the domestic cost is that, or why we see this link with repression is because liberalization actually hurts state elites, right? And the states elites need to get paid off in order to accept that bargain. And the way they get paid off is by giving them more capacity to repress other people in their own society to get stuff that compensates for that. That's the twist on the argument that Christian was offering before, and that would be the twist of your argument. So I'd like to see that as actually economic liberalization, or if compliance with international economic treaties would be fine too. Measuring collective action capacity of the elites. Again, I would go back to the party stuff, and here I'll plug work that data will be available in a month or two. I'll have posted on a website, basically looking at whether or not the party selected the leader or the leader selected the party, and also whether the leader of the party, of the support party, whether the regime leader can select, unilaterally select members of the leadership selection committee, right? So a lot of regimes will have a Politburo or some sort of group that gets to control the party, and does the regime leader control access to the group that controls the party?
June.
Yeah, sorry. And about this collective action thing, and in addition to what Joe had just said, I would say maybe the military personnel, like some of the Q literature use that as the larger the number of people, it's difficult to coordinate or something like that. So it's like, and also maybe like ethnic composition of the military a lot of different ethnic group in the military, it's difficult to coordinate. It's more focused on the party and these type of things, but I'm more talking about military itself and how they coordinate. So I think the number of personnel, I'm not saying these are right, but these are some things the literature on the coup typically use. So I just telling you.
Jose?
These are excellent suggestions. Thank you. So I had a few more questions, if that's okay. Okay. So another one was I wasn't sure about was I was interested, kind of trying to get at this. So are you actually providing political control, or are you just trying? And the different kinds of so for example, physical integrity rights versus just constraints on civil liberties, right? And so that was kind of the motivation behind the margin of legislative majority. So trying to get at that. Okay, so how is this political control really reflecting on the institutions? So if you had suggestions for that too.
I mean, so this is like where this. I envision at one point there'll be this intriguing combination between like Siri and PTS, right? So I like Siri's disaggregation. I don't like their lack of attention to things like scope. I like PTS's sense of scope and general lethality. I don't like the fact that you can't disaggregate stuff. So to get at what you're talking about, you kind of need a hybrid combination of both, right? Because you could get away with shooting some people just as long as the scope isn't too broad, right? You keep it more or less selective. I think you can get a large number of people to go along with that. You also might be able to get a large number of people to go along with a low lethality kind of constraint if people aren't necessarily seeing themselves as the people that will be constrained, right? So from that perspective, I think you're getting at something interesting, which is kind of like, what will this selectorate accept? But in terms of getting at what they'll accept, you're either going to make some choice that, okay, it's really just kind of a dichotomous tactic thing, which is what Siri would get you, right? It's just like, okay, either it's there or it's not. Or you're going to be like, okay, well, people are really not going to take a 4 and a 5, but they might take a 2 and a 3. And this is going back to kind of like, I mean, I don't think we spent enough time thinking about what differentiates the 1, the 2, the 3, and the 4, and the 5. But if you look at that, if you carefully look at how they differentiate from one another, it's not just tactic, but it's scope. And that you might get some cutoff points from like, okay, your selector might accept this, but it won't accept that. And get away from thinking of the categories as being continuous and think of them as being potentially distinct categories, and that you might be predicting 2s and 3s, but not 4s and 5s. And that might get you somewhere at your kind of cutoff point. I think what you're trying to suggest is that there's a cutoff point that the selector is not going to be interested in allowing certain things to kind of escape beyond a certain like lower or specific level of application, but above that, they'll be like, oh, no, we can't do that, because in that context, they might get wrapped up in it. But that doesn't even capture, right? Because you could have high scope, but it's not your group, in which case you're okay with it. And so part of my thing is, if you had better information about the selectorate's connection to the authority, right? Like, who are they? How are they supporting it? How are they related? Is it this ethnic designation? Is it a geographic one? I mean, that would give you more purchase in being able to separate the kind of like the bluntness of the state just going out to people, or we know who our selectorate is, so we're not going for that characteristic, but we're going for these other people over here that are going to interfere with labor or wages or something. If you can make that kind of break point, I think that would be useful. Lauren.
Thanks. So I guess to go in a slightly different direction, all of that I think is really important, but I would also say, rather than getting multiple measures of different types of repression, because that's not, minus the point that you want to kind of separate out repression of the selectorate, I think what would be important, if you go in the direction that we're talking about, is to get some kind of measure of whether the elite, the selectorate, is benefiting or not from this liberalization. So something like a measure of inequality, I think, would be perhaps a good way to go with this, because if you're really going to position this as saying, the elite need to be compensated for giving something up economically to the international community, as opposed to the elite, as Christian was saying, are just, you know, getting richer because now the pie is getting bigger because this international investment is coming in, and that's happening at the expense of the people. You know, it sounds like that's the direction that this is taking. And so, you know, if you just have one kind of core measure of repression, whether that's PTS, and then like robustness tables in the appendix where you show that actually the exact measure that you use doesn't really matter, I think that would give you more space to focus on whether the selectorate is benefiting or losing out in this new arrangement that would, yeah, be important for your theory.
Will.
Jose, yeah, I'm wondering, I think this is connected, but I'm wondering if you need to have a conflict between the executive and the selectorate on in that second round. I mean, is it at all plausible to you to think that, you know, when the elite has to go out and, engage in this activity that messes up the status quo and who gets to pursue rents, et cetera, because of complying with the international system, that the elites respond, that many, the majority in the selectorate are saying, whoa, all right, hold on. If we've got to take this cost, then you sure as hell better stick around, right? In other words, that the exit option of having to put up with new bargains with a new leader are really unappealing to everyone whose ox wasn't specifically gored by that thing. And so what you're really getting is the leader actually wants more repression because it improves their ability to gain power, unless that's really inconsistent with the coup-proofing stuff, which people were arguing earlier, and I'm not going to weigh in on that. But I wonder if that, if that's not a plausible, if not compelling story to tell, rather than the current version, which says, well, the elite has to commit more repression because that's how they get the. Oh, sorry, I thought Michael wanted to jump in. Michael was saying goodbye. So let me leave it at that, Jose.
Jose?
So just to clarify, you mean that perhaps the story is that both the ruler and the selector are interested in increasing repression to maintain political control?
Because they've had to give up something, that their interests are not, their interests in more repression are actually aligned, right, rather than in conflict, which would change payoffs, right? One of the concerns you were having is that there's a payoff conflict. And we don't need a real-time response, and we're running out of time anyway, but that popped into my head, and it may not make any sense, but I wanted to throw it out there as something you may want to consider.
Okay.
Take us out.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I can't thank Joe or Michael except here on YouTube. But we always like to close out by recognizing our referees, who are discussants or whatever the heck we call you guys, who are willing to take time out to not only read somebody's working paper, but then spend 90 minutes online talking about it. And in some cases rather late at night, as it is in the UK right now. So thank you for being willing to jump in, and please, if encourage people with working papers to submit, or yourselves. We have the call for papers is in July, August / November, December, and so please keep an eye out for it. We'd love to see submissions. Beyond that,
thanks
thank you
both
much
for organizing.
Thank you very much
so
for
much.
taking the time. I really appreciate it.
All right, take care, everybody.